We good to go? Okay, I'm getting the thumbs up, the international symbol for it's okay to go. Thank you all for coming this morning. And we have an illustrious panel of guests who I'm going to get them to introduce themselves because I think they'll do a better job than me. The topic of this panel is extremely simple. Should you take money from Google and Meta? And while the topic is simple, I have a feeling the answer is not going to be simple. Well, for some people it might be. Anyway, let's get underway. And Lars, why don't you say a bit about yourself, and then maybe we could start by, you could tell us how much, in round numbers, you get from either Google or Meta or both.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Lars Boering. I'm the director of the European Journalism Center Foundation, based in Maastricht. We are there to develop, support, and strengthen journalism. We do this through grants, fellowships, meetup training. We make available resources and knowledge for free. We have a partnership with, at this moment, with Google News Initiative. At this moment, not with Meta, but we had that before, formerly known as Facebook. I would say that with Google News Initiative, we have roughly, dollars, right? We want to have dollars, roughly...
Or euros, doesn't matter.
Yeah, $450,000 in programs. So this is not direct funding. This is all going into activation and running programs and projects.
And when you say programs and projects, can you describe a little bit what do you mean?
We have summits that we organize with some defined topics, but for instance also fellowship. Together with them we bring 30 young students that into the newsrooms of Le Monde, the Volkskrant, La Repubblica, a paid internship or a paid fellowship as we call it, and we think it's important that this pay is there because then you get a much more equal position. And the innovation comes from the new ones coming in. Our data journalism platform, datajournalism.com, is a partnership which is very important and flourishing.
And have you had discussions with Meta about what are you looking for from them?
Yeah, I started 10 months ago. So before my time, we had a COVID emergency fund with Facebook, since I took on the job, I started the conversation. But I think it's important that you define something that you have in common, or that something that you want to improve or want to change. I think it's easy to go to them and say, "Give me your money." I don't think they're going to give it to you, nor should they. But to find a common project or a common thing that you want to take on is important. For me, talking to Meta right now, I think it would focus more on visual journalism than anything else.
And I guess I'm just going to throw this out there. I want to come back to it. But do you feel that Google and or Meta care about journalism? Pretty simple question.
I think.
Yes or no?
Well, yes, but I think what I see is especially. I can't talk about Meta right now because I've seen what we've done with the COVID fund, and I got approached by journalists that have been working with it, and they were extremely happy and excited and thankful. With Google News Initiative, yeah, I think that they do care, and I think that the investments they do in journalism, not just in Europe but globally, I think they are well meant, and they are also impactful. Yeah, so I think they care a lot about journalism, but it sits in, of course, this monster of a company, so it's super small. But yeah, if something super small is doing something good, yeah, maybe that's where we are at right now.
Okay, great. I'm going to go down to the end to Charlie for reasons that will probably become obvious. And Charlie, if you could just say a bit about yourself and what you do, and then
Some thoughts.
Some thoughts. Yeah, I'm Charlie Beckett, and
Oh, and how much money you get from...
yeah.
Before the thoughts, maybe you could say that.
Yeah. Matthia's here, isn't it? Matthias, is it €1 million or is it £1 million by the end of the year? Is it €1 million or pounds? Euros. Euros.
Okay.
Yeah. By the end of this year, we'll have been funded by about €1 million over 4 years for the program Journalism AI that we've been running.
4 years, okay.
Yeah, over 4 years. So in fact, pretty trivial sums when you look at it over 4 years.
Not to me.
But it's been enough. I don't get paid that. I'm a professor at the London School of Economics. But it's funded our project for 4 years, and it's a project which, if you're going to have a look at it, like Lars at the European Journalism Centre, is utterly devoted to empowering journalists to make the most of this set of technologies to further their editorial mission. And it's been, though I say it myself, it's been incredibly effective. I'm inspired by the innovation and reflection and thought that the journalists and news organizations that we work with have displayed. News organizations right around the world, many of whom are struggling to find the revenue and resources and expertise to do their work. And our belief is that these AI technologies may be able to help them, and we include a critical approach to these technologies. We don't say they're some sort of magic dust, but they might be able to empower your editorial mission. And indeed, we've included critical elements. Yesterday we organized a panel of journalists around algorithmic accountability, journalists who know about AI and the tech companies and are doing fantastic investigative watchdog journalism about them. So I'm very comfortable with what I do. I think it's interesting, though, the title says, should media organizations accept funding? And for me, as an independent think tank, I've got no problem with doing that. I think it's an interesting question for newsrooms themselves. I think then it raises all sorts of issues about dependency on technology in general, and as we've seen in the past, on particular companies that then change their algorithm, for example. So there are real kind of issues about that, how that relationship is operationalized. And just to sort of conclude, to talk about my situation, or our situation at Journalism AI, because it's quite an interesting template. When I first went to my colleagues in the Department of Media and Communications at the LSE, the LSE has a terrific tradition of engagement with the world. It's absolutely set up to do brilliant theoretical, academic research and teaching, but its mission has always been to know the causes of things, but then to have an impact upon society. So I go to my colleagues and say, hey, Google want to give me some money to do some really interesting work, which is going to be interesting research, will inform the teaching, but is also going to have an impact on society, on journalism. And they said, quite rightly, they said, well, hang on a second, we happen to do a lot of research which is very critical of the technology companies, and it's going to be something of a, an issue if we are seen to be taking money from the same people. So the way we resolved that was by having a kind of distancing. So the money doesn't go to my department. It goes to Polis, the independent think tank, as a kind of consultancy. And we're incredibly transparent about it. You can, I've just told you the money involved. You can see exactly what we do with it. And I think, on balance, I know for a fact that I wouldn't have got the money from anywhere else. And so this thing would not have existed. So there was a pragmatic decision on my part. I'm not doing this because Google asked me to do it. I'm doing it because it aligns with my work over many years on technology and journalism. But that arrangement I thought was quite interesting within my university to sort of safeguard the principles of academic freedom and integrity. So it's very much a relationship that has a kind of, well, not particularly tension actually, because sotto voce, Google are actually rather lovely funders compared to foundations and advertisers and other commercial arrangements. It's very nice. They don't intervene. So far, at least, they keep giving me the money, and so I'm quite happy with it.
And it doesn't go directly into your pocket, is what you're saying?
No, I do get a fee as well. Sorry, I should say I do get a fee on.
So some of it does.
Sorry?
Some of it does, then.
Yeah. Some of it comes to me.
But not €1 million.
Yeah, not enough to change my life. No,
Okay.
not the €1 million.
Okay.
So this is a credit to my team. Mathew and Sabrina and Lakshmi. It's a tiny team, and I think we produce an enormous amount of stuff that is useful and beneficial and practical and very interesting. So there's quite a big bang for the bucks, and the bucks aren't huge.
Do you specifically talk about Google in the training or the research?
Yeah.
Or is it
If you go and look at our
specifically-
original report, there's a section in the original report. We did a survey of what journalists around the world think about, AI, and it includes a section on what do you think about the tech companies, and they're very explicit. They talk about, supping with the devil and the tension of that relationship. And I think it's also important to think of this in a context. Here we are in, Western Europe. We work with a lot of smaller newsrooms in the global south. And they don't have the luxury of saying, no, actually, we'll go to this other foundation, or we've got this fantastic advertising budget, or we've got wealthy citizens who can afford to subscribe 500 quid a year. They desperately need support and help, and we're very much focused on those smaller global south newsrooms. So for them, this would be a rather luxurious debate to have.
It did occur to me, though, that when you said they were lovely people and very nice, when the devil comes, he very rarely, has fire and smoke. He's always very well dressed and well spoken and buys you coffee.
You obviously haven't
and
met
so
Google
forth.
people. If you
I'm
think
not
they're
making any
well-dressed,
associations. I'm just saying.
I think the point is, of course, last year, spending on AI, for example, in the private sector, the investment, in everything, banking, hospitals, all that stuff, doubled. It was huge, it's massive. The world is becoming algorithmically driven, data-driven. That is the reality of the world we inhabit. And journalism is tiny. Our industry is absolutely vanishingly tiny compared to those others. And so we are at a disadvantage with respect to this technology. It's not being designed for us. It's being designed for banking and, driverless cars. So it's so important that we engage. And
It may not
to be
even
honest, it's hard to get Google's attention.
It may not even be good for journalism.
Well, that's another argument. The argument around what happens with, algorithmic journalism and so on. That's another argument. But it's actually, Google News Initiative is wonderful. They're focused on us as an industry, obviously. But the larger company, and I guess this applies to Meta, journalism is pretty relevant to them.
Do you think they care about it?
No, not deeply. In a sort of financial sense, no. In the sense that it's a tiny. The idea that they're supporting us because they can make money out of selling us tools and stuff is ridiculous. My main task, if I can be honest, is to get their attention. Is to say, please, can you get your engineers to engage with us to try and build open, accountable tools? And of course, my project, if you go and look at the website, the case studies, there's loads of other people who can produce, for example, open source systems and software and so on.
I don't want to leave Emily behind, so maybe we could move to you. And how much money do you get from Google and Meta? And say a bit, obviously, about yourself, please.
Sure. Hi, I'm Emily Bell. I'm director of the Tower Center at Columbia Journalism School, Columbia University in New York. My career, though, was mostly spent in newsrooms, principally with The Guardian. I should disclose as well, I'm now on the commercial board of The Guardian too, so I have a sort of board director's hat on. But in my research role at Columbia, I can give you a big round number that we can get from Meta and Google, which is 0. We can't do our work if we take money from the platforms. One of the long tracks of study that we've produced work on at the Tower Centre is that relationship between platforms and publishers. I just don't think it's possible. You can't do honest research if you take money from the people that you're actually investigating. It leaves us at a big disadvantage to some of the other people in our field because they're pretty generous funders. A lot of journalism research is funded by Google and Facebook now. I think the Reuters Institute do amazing work, but their research budget is principally funded by Google and Facebook. So that's the answer to how much do I take? 0.
So that was easy.
Yes.
I obviously, there's some tension here between some of these answers, and I wondered, how do you feel about, if I can paraphrase what Charlie said, in addition to them being lovely people, I think his argument is that as long as you're transparent about it and there's some shared, and I think Lars mentioned this as well, there's some shared interest, it's something that's potentially going to benefit journalism, where's the harm, in doing
Right.
it?
So, don't think about Meta or Google, think about the CIA, for instance. It's a useful thought exercise, right? Because Google and Meta have very close relationships with governments around the world. They are collectors of surveillance data around the world. They are not transparent in how they use that data or their relationships with governments around the world. You hope that they are on the side of good and on the side of democracy. They're not that different from the CIA, to my mind. So if you wouldn't take money from the CIA, this is just a thought experiment. I'm just saying this is just a thought experiment, but I think it's a really useful one. So, in the hierarchy, Mathew, of should people take money? So I bumped into my dear friend and sometime collaborator, Julia Angwin, who runs the Markup in New York. I said, I'm going to a panel. Should journalists take? She said, it's a very short panel. The word is no. And then we laughed. But it's not as simple as that because
No.
she and I are in New York City. We are in, to some extent, sort of elite institutions. We are absolutely not in a position where we can and should be telling people who are struggling to pay their journalists and keep the lights on, and are in parts of the world where, as Charlie rightly says, can't actually get funding from anywhere else. To make moral judgments. This is not a moral judgment on that plane. But I do think there's a sort of a hierarchy of questions for news organizations, one of which is, do you really need the money? So I think that, without doubt, there are a lot of organizations that really need the money. The biggest checks go to organizations that don't really need the money. So why are Google and Facebook? So just to say, one of the projects we're doing at the Tower Centre, which is taking a very long time, is collecting all of the aggregated data and doing some of our own investigations into which payments go where. It's really difficult. Google, it has to be said, is much more transparent on that side than Facebook. I don't know whether that's because they're a more transparent company or just that Facebook is a little bit more chaotic. But there is literally no record of where every dollar, euro, pound has gone into news organizations from these companies. It doesn't exist. And it might exist through GNI, but there are lots of other ways in which these companies are in the heart of newsrooms. They're in the technology stack. They have relationships with editors, news editors, journalists, that other advertisers, frankly, don't have. So the first question is, if you don't need the money, why are you taking it? And if you don't need the money, why are they giving it to you? Because often they don't need to give it to you either. So one of the really interesting things about, for instance, News Tab is that these are payments from, licensing payments from Facebook to use journalism within, the new News Tab. It was announced in New York City Robert Thompson sat on stage at the Paley Centre with Mark Zuckerberg saying this is what we've wanted forever. News Corps, this poor, downtrodden organisation, has successfully lobbied for a very large cheque, the size of which we don't know.
Which they don't need.
Well, and which where we are being paid fairly for our content. Well, so maybe that's the case. Facebook could continue, and News Corps would continue to publish links to Facebook without that payment. So it's not really a proper contract. It's not really quite the same as syndication money, because that's not quite how these organizations work. So what is it? Why would large technology companies be paying journalists?
And I think there is an aspect of, you said, why are they giving it to you? Obviously, if you need it, that's one reason, but it's probably not the main reason. One other reason could be that they see you as part of a marketing campaign about how much they care about journalism.
Well, these companies are great at lobbying. They spend more at lobbying, particularly in the US. So, and I want to separate out the people working on the news programs, some of whom are actually former students of mine, who are, in fact, one of the key funders of Charlie's program is a former student of mine who is excellent. And these are people, the people in those news programs really genuinely do care about news.
Right.
But their budget comes central decision making. And to what extent centrally the companies care about news, I think should be defined from their broader activities.
Right, and I think particularly in Facebook's case, it feels to me as though there's this much caring about journalism from former journalists, many of whom are lovely and talented people, and then there's this much, the size of this room, or perhaps this county or even country, that is fundamentally not that interested in journalism and perhaps even opposed to it in fundamental ways.
Well, they're advertising companies. 98% of their revenue comes,
Right.
sort of slightly lower on Google's one, comes from advertising. They're advertising companies, but they're also aligned with governments. They are, sometimes you can see from Google's transparency report how often they, for instance, respond to requests for user data from federal authorities in each country around the world. Somewhere like the United States has very, very high response rate, so de facto kind of arms of a sort of law enforcement, etc. These are not generally sourced, and I think this is really important as well, which is, so do you need the money? Does it affect how you do your work? I think it doesn't affect probably how local outlets do their work in countries. I think it does affect, I think it definitely has an effect. And I know this because in sort of the early 2000s, I was running the Guardian's digital newsroom, and we had a really close relationship actually with the people who were building Google News, and then we had a very close relationship with the people who were building Apple products. Luckily for me, Facebook were not really on the scene at that point, and when they came in and said, hey, you should do this with Facebook, my advice was we should absolutely not do that with Facebook. But I know how those relationships work, and I think that you can have all the good intentions in the world, but when Google News come into your newsroom and say, if you just rewrite your headlines like this, your stories will suddenly start to appear above the Telegraph stories. So you can say, well, that's not really influencing our work, it's just doing what's required. It does really influence your work. And you can't separate those things out. And you would have closer relationships, incidentally, with some of those people than you might do with other journalists, either at other organizations or sometimes even at your own organization. So the idea that it doesn't affect your work, I think very much you have to interrogate that. And where does the money come from? So where this money you're getting from the platforms, where does it come from? Does it come from extractive, exploitative practices in other parts of the world? Does it come from an unfair advertising market?
I talked to an Italian journalist who I won't name, and a couple of things came out of that I thought were interesting. One was, this is only a single example, but I thought it was instructive. A local, a small town community has an old-fashioned newspaper, not very digital, And there's a quasi sort of local digital entity in that market that's part of a chain of similar local digital entities in other markets. And they carry rewrites of stories from real newspapers, if you want to call them that, and a lot of clickbait. And Google funds them because they're local, but they're not really local. But they sort of, it checks a box. So if Google can say, well, we're funding local journalism, but I mean, are they really, or are they actually doing more damage to local journalism?
So I think this
There was a second thing she said that was interesting, which was, so she has taken money from Google. She works with a project, and she said, when I asked her this question, she said, there's no clean money.
Yeah.
She said you can take money from rich people. They probably made it selling guns or alcohol or cigarettes to somebody. You can take it from oil and gas companies. You can
take it from the CIA.
You could take it from the CIA. Many of them are wonderful people, I hear.
So many wonderful people. So I'll just very quickly say this and I'll shut up, which is, so that point about how it affects local, etc. So I think there's a something really profound is happening as we see in legislation introduced to arbitrate this relationship, both in Australia and now in Canada. It's just been dropped in Brazil from some lobbying. Looking at the United States, which is really important in this sort of developing, are we going to regulate this or not, is really interesting. So Google and Facebook have put much, much more money into the United States than they have anywhere else in the world in terms of journalism support. And I would say they are absolutely the backbone of keeping certain local outlets going, because they act in lockstep, and they act in lockstep with other big foundations. And without a doubt, we would have seen more journalism disappear in local markets. However, if you look at the dollar amounts going into local journalism in countries where there is legislation, it is much, much higher per capita than the checks that Google and Facebook are signing voluntarily. So the one thing we know from this short experiment is that if you force negotiation, arbitration, or taxation, or whatever mechanism it is, through a regulatory instrument, you guarantee a higher level of income for news than if you leave it to the companies voluntarily. Now, in the United States, there is something called the JCPA, which is a collective bargaining act just gone into the Senate. I think it has absolutely no chance at all of passing. But the JCPA is a bit like the Australian News Media Bargaining Code. Interestingly, there is very little support for the JCPA among smaller local publishers. And I was talking last week on a panel with Steve Waldman, who runs the...
Because they know they won't get anything from it.
Well, no, they don't know that, because actually that's not true. That is a lobbying line which has been put out by Google and Facebook, which is only the big publishers are getting the money. That is not what our research is showing. It's just not showing.
Isn't that what happened in Australia?
No, it's not what happened in Australia, but people keep repeating it because it is the thing it is the thing that the platforms keep telling you.
Why would the platforms want to say that, though? Why would that be their message?
Because that is what stops the lobbying of smaller publishers banding together and pressurizing it. So the smaller publishers are, first of all, getting money from Google and Facebook in really small amounts. Secondly, there is a line which is being advanced that says smaller publishers are disadvantaged by these new types of regulations. I've been talking to the Canadian publishers about it, who are saying we're absolutely going to make sure that that isn't happening in this case.
So your answer...
But in America, where they've put more money into the market, surprisingly, the one thing that has not happened is that you do not have collective bargaining, a will for collective bargaining among local newsrooms, because I think they have been neutralized.
So your argument, so your response to the question of this panel is yes, you think money should come from Google and Meta,
absolutely,
but not directly to journalism organizations.
I think directly into journalism organizations,
but through legislation,
through their decision and grant making, I don't think is healthy. I think you can tax them. You should tax them.
But in Australia, don't they just give money to publish? They cut deals with the publishers they want,
and
They
they don't
do.
cut deals with publishers that they don't want.
No, that's not
So
true.
how- so
That's
how
not
is that
true.
different
That's
than
not, that's
them
not
just
true,
giving
Matthew.
checks
also,
to who
Matthew,
they
that's
want?
factually incorrect.
Okay.
So it is a negotiate arbitrate
Right.
model, which means that if they will not negotiate with the publishers, then there is a legal instrument to push them into arbitration. Is the Australian government enforcing that? No.
Right.
So
Does
the
it cover-
legal framework
Does it
exists.
cover every publisher?
If you are a publisher that's defined as, and I can't remember exactly, there's a very
There's a
thick
cutoff,
figure.
is there not?
Yeah, there's a cutoff, and you have to prove certain things to be included as a newsroom.
So if you're smaller than that, you don't get access to this.
You can still get access if you're a reasonably small newsroom, but it's like if it's you, Matthew, they may say no, we're not giving him any
Okay.
money. He does not count.
So
as a
that's not
newsroom.
good. So I'm
Does
not in
count as a
favor of it.
newsroom.
I'm not in
and
favor of it.
And actually, in Canada, that threshold has dropped. So I think it's sort of something like it can be sort of two
But
or
we're-
three people. So.
Our legislation is still in process, though, so.
Yeah, but my point is,
I want to go to Lars because he's
Sorry,
just
right.
been sitting here trying to say things, and
but my point is the money that they're putting into the market is lobbying money. It is definitely affecting how people are addressing the issue of how should local journalism and all journalism be funded.
Okay.
It's definitely affecting the issue of should you break these companies up or not. You know, it's definitely having an effect, and they're in research organisations and big titles like The Guardian, you know, where I'm a director, because they don't want to be regulated, and
Right.
you know that is why, and they're getting into, you know, they get into policy making spaces.
Yeah.
You know, some of their stuff is absolutely taken seriously,
Right.
and they've done a good job of it.
Lars, got any thoughts?
Yeah, lots of thoughts, and I think it's so fascinating. I'm happy to sit here listening to you as well, because it shows that the simple question has so many angles to it. Talking about local journalism, yesterday I spoke to a small operation of a small minority of Hungarians living in Romania, reaching 6,000 people, but they only can do it through Facebook. And they've tried everything else, and the printing doesn't work, and phone doesn't, it's just through Facebook group. So I thought, okay, that's interesting that they have found a channel to their audience like that. There's so many of these things. Does it need to go directly to it? I mean, I am fine to be an organization, the European Journalism Center, to be in between as a
middleman.
firewall.
Right.
They have the money and the resources. We have things that need to be supported or developed or strengthened. But our main goal, or let's say we don't even start, is that it should be, nobody is in the service of one another. And so they don't interfere with the process that we will take on. I think that's a good thing. But my other thought about advertising, and they are an advertising company, we should not be naive about Google and Facebook or anything else. And there's also this question of money being left out on media, and it all goes to Google and Facebook. But yeah, do we want media to then be financed by advertising? I mean, for a long time they lived lavishly off cars, cigarettes, drinks, cars. I mean, everything that we have found out now that is killing either us or the planet. And we never asked the question, do they care? I don't think they cared about journalism. They cared about how can I have these pages there and how can I advertise, and it's a great way to reach an audience. Doesn't say that we shouldn't be asking the question now, but I find it interesting that this talk is sort of surfacing a kaleidoscope of interesting
And maybe it was
topics.
bad before. I mean, maybe that wasn't a great situation even then. But now we're thinking about it more.
I mean, I don't think we want to go back. I mean, everybody hates advertising, right? Who likes advertising? Yeah, if you work in it and you make a living, but nobody likes advertising. You know, you want to see stuff. That's why all these platforms that have membership-based are flourishing now, because they have no advertising. It's because we pay them. It's either the Correspondent, VilaWeb, it is Mediapar, it's Follow the Money. They're all growing. Why? Because they have a value proposition with journalism. And
Have any of them taken money from?
no, I don't know all about it, but some of them definitely know. They don't take money from anything, except from us, which is good, and we might be bad people and good people.
Do you feel like you're in bed with the CIA? Even metaphorically?
I don't know where we are in bed with. That's maybe the I don't know. It's an interesting metaphor, but we can apply it to everything else that funded journalism through advertising, I would say. We are not naive. There's huge flaws in whether it's Google, Facebook, or anything that you can come up with as a platform. But we're talking about these two. I think it's great that politics and everybody else is also holding them accountable for that or trying to change that for the better. It's good that journalism can report on that. We should do that and we should research that, and I think that should also be supported. And I don't think that can be supported with their money, but it's definitely taking place no matter money or not. And investigative journalism in this topic is extremely important, and I'm happy also to see that, because...
And when you think about cutting a deal with Meta, do you think about what it does to journalism or what it does to information and how bad that can be? Does that concern you?
Yeah, so it's not the CIA that keeps me awake at night, but I do think about it. Yesterday I read the interview with Maria Ressa, who had an awful lot of problems because of Facebook. We all know that, and we all watch it, and we look at it, and she makes also a plea, to take that all on. And so when I read that we should constantly question ourselves: what are we doing here? Is it right? Is it wrong? Do we pose these questions also back to them? I include it in my conversation with them. I say you have to realize that there's lots of people against this. There's some people in favor. There's some people that are really on the fence, and I think most people are a little bit on the fence. Yeah, so not be naive, but also keep a watch on it and see if it would really bring things again to the surface of big problems, then you have to reassess. And I guess that's part of the shift age that we live in. Things change constantly, and but maybe they can also change for the better.
Charlie, has Emily convinced you that you're doing anything you shouldn't, or that...
Sorry, I was just filling in my form to the CIA Journalism Fund. It's quite interesting, actually. The CIA did fund journalism. Is it Horizon Magazine? Yeah. Horizon Magazine.
I'm sure for beneficial purposes.
It's a lovely arts magazine funded by the CIA.
They've invested in tech as well.
Yeah, I'm sure. I think that there is a really interesting. This is a really interesting and important conversation. And it's kind of shifted, quite rightly, from little think tanks to the media industry and the relationship with platform power. And at that point, I would defer to people like my colleague Damien Tambini, who knows a lot more about that struggle around regulation, public interest, and the media and the tech companies. What I do think is interesting, though, is putting it in the context, and Lars kind of alluded to this, that we have more diverse business models for journalism than ever before, I think, and all of them have considerations, all of them, and this is not to make a cynical point, it's an and, not a but. Every way you get funded, and don't kid yourselves, your journalism does need to be funded. Somebody will have to pay for it. Somebody has to give you the resources to do what you do. And if you're doing it well, to do more of it. And all of it comes with tensions. When I was a journalist, I was paid, when I was on a newspaper, it was through advertising, because it was a free newspaper, and then it was a paid newspaper, so I suppose it was the newsagent. And then I worked at the BBC, which was paid through by a regressive tax the license fee. And then I worked at ITN, which was paid indirectly through advertising. But that was the range of models, really. And as has been said, advertising is not particularly pure. You don't have to be Chomsky to say that it's part of the capitalist clampdown to be involved with that. But anything, even if you get your money from some lovely foundation, it's constricting. And I think it also has downsides, that if you get handed a check, whether it's by Google or by a nice foundation, that has a downside. Does it make you less competitive? Does it make you complacent about reaching out your audience?
But when I was speaking to this Italian journalist, and she said there's no clean money, I agreed. That's clearly true in many cases. But specifically money from large tech organizations that, as Emily pointed out, collect data and do whatever they want with it and use algorithms that are completely opaque and exercise pressure on the information environment of all billions of people. It feels to me as though that's a quantitatively different thing.
Yeah.
And their interests.
No, I agree.
Their interests will distort
my point
the
about
way.
The other sources
even
of
if your
funding,
interests are pure, that them being involved with you will shape.
Yeah, for
what
example,
you look
we
at
talk
and what you
about,
don't look at.
In our project, we talk about the kind of biases that are involved by using these technologies. And that's not just the ones we're familiar about, racial bias or gender bias. But the idea that if you rely on data to do your journalism, then you'll tend to do stories that have data.
It's even, to me, it's even more than that. Like Emily, in a way, is talking about things that are much more tangible. I'm concerned about unconscious bias and a sort of favorable.
But do you think that Australian news organisations getting money from Google is making them worse than they already were? Most of them are pretty shite, and they didn't need Google and Facebook to make them
It may make them worse in
shite.
different ways.
Well,
new ways.
Yeah, and that's a conversation that you can then
Somebody
have.
said,
but I don't think Google and Facebook. Emily, I think, was making a different point, which was, may I say, which I do think. No, I mean that's why I'm referring to Damien, because there's a other point, which is it's not that it necessarily makes your journalism worse. It may in itself be inequitable and non-transparent. The way that funding is distributed. That's a different argument. That's a kind of technical argument about how that particular subsidy happens. And also you can have an argument about why it's happening.
Emily,
and that's about regulation.
I feel like you want to say something. It's just a sense I have.
I'm not going to try and explain myself because you'll do it much better. But so just a very simple point about the difference between advertising and the relationship between Google and Facebook, which is actually based on research that we have done, which is that there aren't really any rules or even internal newsroom conversations about how you deal with this money, what the disclosures are, and what the mechanism is for making sure that it doesn't influence your journalism. Now, we have, 100 plus years of discussing this exact subject when it comes in relation to advertising. And every organisation which is currently changing its relationship with advertising, whether it's sponsored content or whether it's branded studios, is having that conversation. Now, they're not. I can tell you, because we are researching this, they're not having that conversation about the disclosure of platform money. One of the reasons they're not having it is because most of these checks are large. They don't come with really any strings attached, and they come with NDAs stapled to them. So newsrooms are not discussing the figures they're getting because they've signed an NDA. Now,
I think there are strings attached. They're just invisible strings.
Well, no, I agree with you. But all I'm saying is it's not an exchange. It's not a transactional contract.
Quid pro quo, yeah.
It's not a contract. And so we don't know how much they are. The newsrooms are not disclosing it. There's no real internal discussion in most newsrooms. Some of them there are. We came across one newsroom that had a really intense internal and external discussion, which was a small, actually Canadian newsroom, about whether or not they should take the money.
I'm sure I know them. We all know each other.
And then a very bizarre thing has happened, which is that the promised check that was going to turn up from one of the platform companies was originally, they said, we really worried about it because it's $40,000. And for a small newsroom, that was a large sum of money. So we debated this, and we asked our readers, and we talked about it on Twitter, and we came to the conclusion that if we were going to survive the pandemic, we should take the check. He said, and then a week later, they sent us a check for $100,000, which we hadn't even asked for. And we have, and sort of, and it's kind of interesting, which is, you know, that if you're, there is also a charm circle. There are a charm circle of researchers and newsrooms that participate. My favourite question this week has been, you know, are you going to the Meta drinks? It's like, no, I've not been invited to the Meta drinks, surprisingly.
I was invited. I couldn't get in though.
But you know, but there's a charm circle. Just very briefly, one anecdote from a newsroom leader in Europe who had been trying for years to go to Newsgeist. And I was interviewing them for this project we're doing about how you disclose money. And they said, I finally got to Newsgeist, and the most bizarre thing happened, which is that lovely, lovely man, Richard Gingras, and even lovelier man, Mathew Ingram, stand up. The first thing they do at Newsgeist is they play this game called Werewolf, where all the publishers in Europe sit with their eyes closed, and Mathew and Richard decide which ones are going to live and which ones are going to die. And I couldn't believe that this was the after-dinner entertainment.
That's a good point, yeah.
This is like literally what is happening in our industry, and nobody
I
was like, hang on a second.
I have played that game. It's really fun, actually. Not the real-life game where your
It's worse
organization
than that, actually.
dies.
It's not that the Google people in that game are killing the
It's other
journalists.
journalists.
It's the journalists are killing
It's
each
other
other.
journalists, yeah. Which says a lot about our industry. But anyway, it hasn't escaped me, obviously, as it hasn't escaped a lot of people that they put on lovely festivals like this one, or they help put them on. They help pay for the food that we're eating. They help pay for these lovely rooms that we're in. I find it hard to concentrate, actually. We don't have ceilings like this where I come from. And, you know, Newsgeist is a wonderful event, and journalists go, and we talk about important topics. And the whole time I'm there, I feel this vague disquiet. So it's not that we're not talking about important issues, and journalists care about them, and Mathew cares about them, and Richard cares about them, and I know most of the people on the teams in both companies, and they're lovely. It's just that they care this much, again, and their companies have all these other agendas that have nothing to do with journalism, and in fact may be antithetical to journalism. And that's the thing that troubles me. I did want to mention we're not supposed to take questions for COVID reasons, but so you can, if you wish, you can tweet me. Well, so you can do one of two things. You can stand up and shout your question, or
Just say it gently.
Or you can say it. You don't have to shout.
And then you can repeat it.
Or you can tweet me. I'm at Mathew I with one T, and I'd be happy to ask your question if you're not comfortable standing up and saying it. So, are there any at the moment? Yeah, you.
I'd like you to address a little bit more how this conference, these 5 days, are being paid for to a large extent by Google and Facebook. And would you be on a panel in a beautiful room paid for by the CIA?
If it had a ceiling like this, then maybe.
Well, I haven't worked for the CIA, although I wouldn't dismiss it. I've worked with NATO. I've been paid by NATO, for example, which now
They're good,
apparently is a great force
They're
for
good,
good and
though.
freedom. But,
Yeah.
you know,
I'm not sure we should address the conference itself, like the funding. That's not really our. I know they.
I really don't have a problem. It's
I know
fun-
they do
It's
contribute.
funded by an oil company.
For sure, they
before.
contribute.
What I heard yesterday, he's a friend of mine, and he's a journalist, he's a funder, and he's concerned. We talked about it, and he said, "Yeah, actually, isn't it a disgrace that it's being funded by these journalists?"
A disgrace.
And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because it should be funded by the media." And I was like, okay.
Like we have that kind of money.
We talked about the Dutch situation, where one of the main big groups that now control most of the newspapers, there's two, but one of them just made a profit of, I think, 230 million euros.
Wow.
talking about there's no money to be made in journalism. Well, there is, but they certainly don't put it back into stuff like this, right?
That's fair.
So you could also call ourselves out and say, look, the money is being given to us here, and yeah, great that we are here.
Was he
But
staying
some,
at the conference, this person who said it was a disgrace? Was he at the conference?
Yeah, he was here at the conference, and he was wearing this wonderful key.
I admire that.
But again, that's kind of flipping it around. Somehow, if we value journalism and get-togethers like this so much, then why is it not coming from there anymore? Maybe we haven't asked, or maybe they don't give a shite, as you said.
We do them, though.
I've been in a room very like this on a panel which was paid for by DARPA, who were trying to get researchers to do work for DARPA, which we turned their money down as well. This is if there's anyone here, so that's the Defense Department in the US, so basically sort of defense industries. If anyone here has money to give us, I'd be very grateful. Who's not from the CIA or DARPA or the major tech platforms?
DARPA is a defense research
Yes, so
agency.
it's a government defense research, and they're very interested
Space
in all of these
lasers and
areas.
stuff.
And so they sign big checks. So yes, I think again it's engagement, or I think paying for this platform. I used to come to this conference before it was paid for by Google and Meta, and it sort of nearly went under. It does make me a bit, an oil company sponsored it.
And to be fair, Craig Newmark sponsors it as well.
And to be fair, Craig, who we do get money from, actually.
Was there another question over here? I think, yeah.
I thought it was very interesting how you mentioned the newsroom that internally debated whether to take money or not, and that brought me to the question, isn't this also a topic of newsroom culture? Because I've never heard of any newsrooms where there's an internal debate who to take money, because it's top down, owner decided on.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a good point.
It's also slightly disadvantaging non-profit newsrooms because they have to disclose where all of their money comes from. So it shows up in their 990s, or they disclose it on their websites. And what's actually happening is that the commercial companies that are probably taking as much, if not more, are not actually forced to disclose. And if they've signed NDAs, they won't disclose. So weirdly, it actually puts non-profits that have ethical practices at a slight disadvantage, not least because their commercial competitors, again, we've heard this from newsrooms, go around saying to, for instance, subscribers, you shouldn't subscribe to them because they're paid for by Google and Facebook.
Was there a question over here? Yes.
I'm not sure if I could. Can you repeat the question?
Do you, I think this is what you were saying, do you keep track of or monitor how that money influences journalistic organizations that you help support? Is that right? Is that about right? Or do you just give it to them and then they...
No, we do get reports because we also want to. One of the things that I find important for us is there's for every problem in journalism, there's 10 NGOs trying to solve it, but most of them only try to reach their goals, right? So I got money in, I'm going to give it to you, and look at this article being published. What we do is we want to also measure for impact, and so I think that is at least what we do. We also have now a lot of money, more than ever, going to freelance journalists, because I don't think not all big media need this support. So yeah, we definitely look at that. But for us, it's important that we can give them the money and that they deal with us and they don't have to deal with the funder. Yeah, but this is, I think it's very important. We also select the grantees independently. So we also put, again, a jury in between very often. So yeah, there is a mechanism there to keep track of that.
Was there another question back there? I think there was one. No? Yes?
I'd like to ask regarding the future of young journalists in Google and Meta. So obviously to be more involved in Google and Meta in the future. For example, there's many initiatives that promote like young journalists, like the Journalism Fellowship in Europe. So my question is, what advice would you give to young journalists? Should we jump into this head first, or should we be wary when we become involved in initiatives such as these?
That's a great question.
Can I just reply to that question by asking a question to everyone here? How many people in this room work for a news organization that makes a profit in the market? Yeah, a handful. And all I'm saying is that this debate, as I referred to earlier, there's such a diversity of business models. And I personally, being a bloodthirsty capitalist, believe that the free market and competitiveness and commercialness are an important form of news organization, for all sorts of reasons.
I don't want to cut you off, Charlie, but we're sort of running out of time. Emily, do you have an answer?
No, I was just going to say that the great thing, one more sentence. The
Yep.
great thing as a young journalist now, compared to when I was a young journalist, is you have a choice. You can go and work for the Mail online, clickbaity, advertising-funded journalist, or you can work for a so-called not-for-profit, mission-driven, foundation-funded, or membership, or whatever. And I think that's very exciting.
But your fellowship might be funded by Google.
So you can go and work for the CIA-funded one if you want.
Emily, what would you say?
I mean, we have lots of students who are on these schemes, and they're good schemes. And
Schemes.
so, and I would say, should you jump in with both feet? Journalists should never jump in with both feet.
Should you jump in with
to
1 foot?
Anything. You should put your toe in very gently and ask yourself all the way, like, why, how much of my foot should I put into this? So I think goes with anything. And, but if the support is there and the community is there, but you just have to do it with an eye to sort of skepticism. And as I said, there are newsrooms in Hungary taking money from, or rather sort of access to Facebook is how they keep going. But Facebook's Viktor Orban page is actually very, very active. So, this is a very complicated question. And I don't think it should be on the people who are under the most pressure in the industry to make those decisions. I think it should be on people higher up the industry to try and form standards and pressure a better kind of relationship.
It's a good introduction to ethical conflicts to make that decision. Lars, did you have
So I think it's a good question, and I would tell anybody that would apply for things to ask us this question as well, right? What is this? Where does it come from? Is it good for me? Do I want this before I jump in? But we're also not the European journalism police, and so we also have to leave it open. But I think more and more these conversations need to be taking place. We need to be transparent about who we partner up with. And we do so, and at the same time we're also open to talk about it. At this moment we work it out as we have it right now, and we're fine with it. But if questions come to us and it's being challenged, then we might have to reassess it. We'll have to see. But for now, I just have that conversation and ask this question.
Any other questions at the back? Was there one? Yes. I think that's for you, Emily.
Yes, that's a great question, actually. We're sort of in the middle of one at the moment. Actually, my colleague and Mathew's colleague, Bill Gruskin, wrote a fairly in-depth, he's been in Australia, and he wrote a sort of an in-depth, more reported piece on it, which said this kind of division between it's no good for smaller newsrooms is really not as clear as it would appear. And also I know that you do have organisations in Australia that are getting perhaps bigger checks that are also now kind of distributing some of that money and pushing it out to smaller newsrooms. You also have a strong collective lobby of smaller newsrooms in Australia saying we're not getting enough. So it's going to take a while, actually, for the full picture to emerge, and what we're sort of doing at the moment is a big data gathering exercise. What we do know is that where checks are signed, they are, in general, much bigger than grant checks. And to put that in context, I think that the Canadian publishers are aiming for something like 35% of editorial costs to be underwritten by the tech companies under the Canadian legislation. I don't think they're going to get to 35%.
No.
I don't think it's healthy. But it's interesting because I think sort of Australia is probably more like sort of 20%, still a significant.
We are just about out of time, but I just wanted to make a point. Someone mentioned in France, they begged for this legislation, as this person puts it, and now every major media is dependent on this funding. It's called compensation for copyright, but they rely on this money and cannot roll back. So I think that's an interesting thought. Even if that money does come, does it then become something that you rely on, in which case you're tied to the tech platforms in one way or another, which is sort of depressing, but we're out of time. So look at the ceiling, it's beautiful, and thank you very much for coming, and thank you to all my panelists.